What's up, kids? This is David here with Solid Next Day, man, and we've got another Godzilla vid in the mix. Yeah, because, we've got to answer that question of how it is that Godzilla has found himself into the pages of the Bible. How it is that Godzilla and the Leviathan of the Scripture seem to parallel one another so prodigiously. How is it that one is so clearly reflective of the other? To the question then, if you will, to the question as to how our modern day Godzilla is so familiar to the Leviathan of the Bible, we may start by supposing that it is not a matter of Scripture telescoping forward in time to capture imagery from our modern world. Rather, it must be that the Japanese creator of Godzilla, Tomoyuki Tanaka, drew inspiration from the ancient myths of the monster in the sea, the Leviathan from of old. So what are these myths as regards the Leviathan? Leviathan was a metaphor in ancient times, a metaphor for chaos. How appropriate then, if you will, is it that Godzilla himself, in the original 1940s film and in the 2016 Japanese film Godzilla Shin, how appropriate is it that Godzilla is the result of nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific? Unleashing the power, the primordial power of chaos, that form-destroying power that is chaos, unleashed by the advent of nuclear weapons, that fundamental force of form-destroying energy unearthed in the splitting of the atom in the atomic weapons. How appropriate is it that this is wherein Godzilla is couched in the modern myth of the beast in the deep? Godzilla, if you will, or the Leviathan, has its root in imagery found in myths born up from the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Canaanites. The Bible, in speaking of the primordial cosmos, uses venerable images found along a great culture arc that runs from Egypt through Greece, through Palestine, Mesopotamia, to India. The writers of Scripture were not appropriating the mythologies of the surrounding cultures, but were instead using language which would have been most readily accessible to the people of the time. The Bible does not repurpose the creation myths of antiquity. Rather, the Scripture employs certain ideas which with to articulate its own unique and certain framework of thought. To the ancient people, their present world was born of primal waters, of primal darkness, of primal chaos. When Genesis 1:2 opens with, "The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters," this language would have resonated with the audience of the day. It is different in that it did not track with the common mythologies depicting great battles between gods wherein chaos was subjugated and the natural world emerged. The Hebrew writers purported a narrative wherein God as creator acts with the highest preeminence, mastery, if you will, over the elements, not in conflict with primal chaos, not in battles between good and evil, but rather fashioning the darkness, the deep, the untamed waters as though they were clay in God's hands. The Leviathan is, for us, in these ancient contexts, a reference to the untamed aspect of chaos. The Leviathan is a caricature, if you will, of chaos's rude, unyielding attributes. The form-destroying overflow that is the flood, the raw potential of the axioms of the cosmos. Leviathan in the scripture is unwielding. In Job 41:2, he is unguidable. Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Leviathan in Job 41:5 is tameless. Will you play with him as with a bird? The scripture reads, will you bind him for your maidens? In Job 41:13, Leviathan is impenetrable. Can you strip off his armor? Leviathan is fierce as a crucible of fire. A flame goes forth from his mouth. Job 41:21 reads, Leviathan's substance is potentious. In his neck lodges strength. Dismay leaps before him. In verse 22. Leviathan then is a metaphor for the untamed cosmos. A cosmos without restraint is a cosmos without life. A cosmos without order is a cosmos without form. An undulating, chaotic sea. But to that effect, we have Psalm 74, starting in verse 13. It speaks to the divine victory over the dragon of the watery abyss. That creative victory, if you will. That divine victory over the dragon of the watery abyss. Thou did divide, and this is speaking of God, thou did divide the sea by thy might. Thou did break the head of the dragons on the waters. Thou did crush the heads of Leviathan. And again in Job chapter 26, starting in verse 12, by his power, and speaking of God, by his power he stilled the sea. Think that in the ancient world, the primordial sea was seen as a fluxing, disordered chaos of darkness, untamed and untamed abyss. And here in Job 26, by God's power, he stilled the sea. By his understanding, he smote Rahab. Rahab was a name for the dragon. That dragon of chaos. By understanding, he smote Rahab. By his wind, the heavens were made fair. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. And so what is this to our purposes here in this video? This idea that God's hand pierced the fleeing serpent. It is this, essentially, man. It is God assigning order to the disorder, wherein the head of Leviathan is crushed. Leviathan is not an antagonist to God. Rather, chaos is formed of God's hand. For God, the beast that is Leviathan, the terrific, the horrific beast, the untamable fire-breathing beast that is Leviathan, is the work of God's hand. But it is primordial. And then it must be subjugated for the purposes of God, that its potential may be unpackaged. Rather, chaos is formed of God's hand, and then chaos is subjugated. Why the drama then surrounding the dragon of the abyss? Why the drama then about the Leviathan? Why is so much made then of this beast Leviathan, this dragon in the sea? It speaks to the profound extent that the foamating surf and untamed waves of the primordial deep must be fine-tuned for life. It suggests the mountain that must be forded, that is the crafting of the stars to burn as crucibles for the elements. It supposes God's command over the monster in the waters when he set the constants of nature. When he assigned a balance of vacuum energy, a kind of negative pressure in space, to 1 in 10 to the 120th power, so that the expansion of space would not warp. The balance of gravity set to 1 in 10 to the 60th power. Otherwise, all the matter in the cosmos would collapse into black holes or diffuse into amorphous cloud, never forming into stars or planets or systems wherein life may have its footing. Consider, if you will, Leviathan as the primordial chaos, a monster whose teeth is as terror, the scripture reads, and yet his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. The beast is the raw potential of the dawn to act as an initiant, as those first footings of the beginning of day. Consider what it means when professed that God has crushed the head of the untamable, that God has smote the chaos. His hand has pierced the fleeing serpent. And when we read in Job 38, consider what it means that God has smote Leviathan. Tell me, it reads in the scripture, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who enclosed the sea with doors, when bursting forth it went out of the womb? When I made a cloud its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band. So think of this. The primordial waters, those primordial waters being herein described as being born. When bursting forth, who enclosed the sea with doors? when bursting forth, when it went forth from the womb. Those primordial waters spilling forth from the womb. And God therein has made a garment for the waters, a cloud, it says. When I made a cloud its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling bands, because it is with swaddling bands that you wrap the newborn. When you receive the newborn, when a mother and father receives the newborn child into their arms, the infant is wrapped in swaddling bands because he or she is wanted, he or she is loved. For God has wanted us in this cosmos. God has loved us in this cosmos. That the beginnings of things, that the beginnings of time were wrapped in swaddling bands. And I placed boundaries on it, the scripture reads. He placed boundaries on the chaos, and I set a bolt and doors. And I said, thus far shall you come, but no further. And here shall your proud waves be stopped. Does that not sound like the constants of nature set into stone? Set into stone. And here shall your proud waves be stopped. How awesome is that? Have you ever in your life commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place? Here again is this primordial imagery. For the beast Leviathan's eyelids are as the dawn, and it says here that God commands the morning and causes the dawn to know its place. Consider then, if you will, that the 6 days of creation in Genesis are not the account of process. They are not a scientific declaration, but rather a statement of God taming the formless deep, subjugating the fearful beast that is chaos, and in so doing giving rise to the realms which are to be inhabited. A house, if you will, built and then filled with possessions, all those goodly possessions that make up the substance of life, and our lives therein that dwell. This I must say in closing, seems to capture, if you will, the intent and the narrative that is Godzilla in the scripture, man. And you can take that to the bank. Boom! Go see Godzilla, bro. And think of what I just said. And then come back and watch this video again. Dude, comment in the comment below, you know, if any of you made it to the end of this video. I would like to hear what you have to say about what it is that I am saying here about Godzilla and this notion, this cosmological poetry that is Leviathan of the watery abyss. Yo, God bless.